The next step in our process will be to start lining up the people. We have a foreground person and a background person. I think since we started with the backplate in this case, we'll continue building the background and then introducing our lovely, beautiful woman at the end. So we're gonna open this file that we have selected for the guy. And again, this is a picture that we really responded to when we were there on location. So I'm going to open this up. Now, as you heard me talk about, when we photographed this, I really should have shot this from a little bit further back. But what happened when I shot this further back, the view I got into the room and of him got really narrow. So I moved closer. Right here, the distance to the door is shorter than initially. So we need to tweak the perspectives here a tiny bit in that I moved closer. And I also worked on the focus. Now, as you see here, this is slightly out of focus. And this right here, where our woman is where the focus is. So we need to match that background focus on the person. Now, when I photographed this, I laid the focus in front, but he got so blurry. So blurry. So what I essentially want to do here is to cheat focus a little bit by blurring him a tiny bit when we get him in there, but not as much as he really should have been had I had my focus on the foreground. So we're cheating things a little bit here, working with having a slightly sharper guy. I chose to photograph him sharp so I could blur afterwards in Photoshop rather than, you know, being there with a really blurry guy and thinking, oh my God, he's too blurry for this story. Because as we know with composition, if we shoot everything with a really shallow depth of field, we don't have really any compositional elements. Your eye will go directly to where the focus is, and all the other elements just falls into this blob of out of focus, which is not the purpose of the story. We really want the dynamics, the conversation between background and foreground. So that's why I ended up shooting this sharper, giving me the opportunity to work with that softness / sharpness in post. So we're going to work on those two things as we put our guy in there. So we're just going to drag this in there. And what I do essentially when I drag this over is just to hold down the command key. The command key will change my selection tool into this arrow tool right up here. So instead of going here selecting this tool, I just hold down the command key. It will make this the drag tool, direction tool right away, and that's it. So when that's done, we're just going to close this out and we're going to just quickly put this in there and see how things line up. The first thing we need to do in this is to select our door. So we're going to turn this off for a minute, and we know that the space that he will live in will be inside this door. We could do it maybe inside this door, but that seems really tiny. So we're going to try this door right here and see how that works. So we're going to take our layer and we're going to create a layer mask. We're going to unlink the layer and the layer mask. This will allow me to create a selection on the layer mask, and within that mask, the opening in the door essentially, we can move around the backplate. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to turn this door off for a minute. Since it's not perfectly masked in there, I'm going to leave that out for now. Let me see. Again, I'm using the lasso tool. I'm holding down my option key. That will allow me to set these anchor points and just pull my selection together. I'm going to turn this, just hide this selection for a minute. When we zoom into this, you can see that this edge here is pretty soft. It's not a crisp edge as if we were selecting the bed sheets in here, for instance. So what we want to try to do here is to make sure that the selection is having the same softness, that is matching this for a minute. So I'm going to undo this and I'm going to come up here. I'm going to go select. We're going to go modify, feather, and in here we can set the radius that this selection just sort of bleeds out. So I would say for this, maybe we'll do 1.5 pixels. And when I did that, you see this corner got a little rounder, and that will indicate that this edge is feathered, and we can come in here and turn this on. And then now that we selected this, we just go again, Option, Delete, which will fill with this area, which is black. We get this black blob in our selection, and that is our door opening. So now that we have feathered this, we need to invert this selection. What we want to do is to mask out everything that's on the outside of the door, and we want to keep what's inside. So Command-Shift-I to invert it. We have our mask selected. It's Option, Delete, which is a foreground fill. And there we have our door, and we can see what's on the other side of it. So let's see. I'll just hide this selection for a minute. Now that we have unlinked those two, we have the opportunity to just move this back door around, and we could put it like that, but it's just one room, and it would be cool to create some more depth to it so that we maybe see this part, a little bit more of that room. Now, you see obviously this doesn't quite line up, and we knew this would happen as I moved the camera in. But again, Photoshop is this time a problem solver, and we're going to make this happen. So we're going to make this a tiny bit smaller. The further away from the camera this sits, the smaller it also will be. So we're going to just line these pieces up a little bit, and we're going to make this a little smaller. Just about here. I'm just trying to find my way in what would be the right size for this. Obviously, when you have one door here and you look into another room, the room behind it would definitely be smaller. So you should see a room within a room within a room in some ways. So if I put it just about here, maybe we should be pretty close to what I would think would be a hallway. Maybe it should even be a little bit wider. And then we have the room beyond it. So let's see a few things here. Now we start getting into the issues of this line here and this line here, and it not being quite right when it comes to perspectives. So we're going to tweak that eventually. For now, this feels pretty good, but I do want to see more of this guy. And I mentioned this when I shot this, that maybe we need to expand this door, and I think we should just do so right away. We're going to take this, just this part here, and we're just going to drag it out a tiny bit. So let's just turn off the things that we don't really need to look at. And we have our background layer right here. We have the small things that we retouched out. So we're going to come in here, and I'm just going to select right inside here. Then I'm going to Command Copy, and then we're going to Command Shift Paste, which is paste in place so that it falls exactly on top of the other frame. And then we're going to select this layer and our retouch layer, which is taking these away. Those are easy to redo, but you know, it's just important to keep our layers together. So I'm going to pull this out like that. I'm going to turn off our door, and then we're going to just hit Command C here and see what happened. This feels quite a bit better to me. Now we have expanded this quite a bit. And because this is slightly blurry, it's kind of forgiving in that you don't see that the pixels are distorted too bad when we start pushing them out. See, these circles are getting, you know, a little bit distorted, but I think that's okay. Nothing that people will look at by the time we get this stuff done. All right, now that we moved things, obviously this door got to move after. And this is kind of the reason that we should not mask things perfectly when we start out. Now we move the door and we move this highlight, and I think maybe I'll just leave this alone for now and turn that off, and eventually it will have a highlight here and a highlight there, and we'll work with what we have for now. So let's see. Here's our guy, and now that we have expanded this opening in the door, obviously we got to expand our selection as well. And I think what we could do for now, we're going to fine tune, is just to select this, hit Command T, and in this some ways just do what we did for the door. We just essentially just pull our selected area out, and now that we have the feather and all that stuff, we'll sort of just use what we got already to line this up. Just about there for now. This makes me feel a lot better about it. We're going to go from the mask into our image layer, and we're going to try to see if we could do something about the misaligning lines here between the different doors so that it feels a little bit more like these are connected. So we're going to hit Command T, and we're going to distort this a bit. We're going to come to perspective, and this end is definitely coming down. I think just like that, we're pretty close. Maybe I'll rotate it a tiny bit back. There. So if you hit Command R, you're going to get the rulers around the pictures. If you come to the edge of that, you could just click and drag, and you get these lines that will allow you to double check how the perspectives are in the picture. And just going to drag a few of these in here so that we have something to work with. So you see I'm fairly decent on the straightness of this door, and we're pretty darn good on the straightness of the door on the inside as well. Seems like it can tip a tiny bit clockwise. So we're going to try that first, and then this tips down a bit, and this seems pretty straight. So that will line up with me tipping the background or the image of the guy clockwise a bit, and I think we should be pretty close. Maybe there's a small adjustment there, but I think just the rotation should get us pretty close to where we want to be. So just about there. Let's do the perspective one more time. There. All right, so we can come in here on view, we come to our guides, and I think we're just going to try to clear the guides. We don't really need them anymore. All right, so I think we're kind of there. What's bothering me a little bit when I look at this is the greenness of it. I think it's alluring, you know, as a color for the landscape, but it kind of affects the people too much. So I'm going to try to add a little bit of color to it as well. I build the files not religiously as in, oh, we're going to put the people in and then we're going to add the color and then we're going to add the finish. It's an organic process where we start building and layering, and as this process unfolds, so does the inspiration, and the life of the picture sort of just takes on its own journey. I could sit in front of the computer for hours and hours and hours and hours and just get completely in the flow. And in that, there's no mechanical approach. It's really an artistic sort of creational approach. So all of it just flows. So I just encourage you for you to find your process in that. If you like to build technically, here's the background, here's the person. Now we're going to do the color. Now we're going to sharpen. Now we're going to fine tune, and then we're going to call it finished. Then that's your process. My process in this, it's a little bit more organic, letting the picture speak to me as I do it. Again, asking ourselves the questions, right? What does this picture feel? Asking ourselves the questions, what did this picture feel like when I took it? What does it feel to me now? What was my original intention? Did I accomplish that objective, or has it changed a little bit? This one certainly has, in that it has a truly monochromatic palette. I also wanted them to sort of look at each other or get some sort of way where they were communicating, but they're not. There's a communication here, but it's completely non-communicative. She sort of glances off towards camera or slightly off camera, and he's distant looking off the other way. So there's none of that dynamic to worry about here in the selects that we have. So organic process. So another little bit of a ramble, but we are going to go into our curves again for the second time in this picture, and we're going to make this color layer. Just going to come into the opposite of green is magenta. So if you want it to be a little less green, we're just going to pull this down a tiny bit, just like that. And we're going to call this for color. I'll talk to this a little bit more later, but there's definitely an order to the way I use my color, contrast, and hue saturation layers. And it's important to keep track of them, because as you explore a file and you think, oh, now I want it to be a little bit more magenta because the picture feels too green, later on you might think, oh, I want it more green again, and you come in here and you create another layer and you go green. What happens is that yes, it works, but you are now starting to really tweak the pixels. You have one layer that says more magenta, and you have another layer that says more green. And those two things will make banding and pixelations quite obvious in your photographs. So we want to make sure to avoid that. So as you move forward, make sure that you have one color layer, one contrast layer, that sits and affect different parts of the picture so that you don't have to add on top and come back to those original layers. So again, important to name your layers so we have some sense of where those layers are. Now that we have our guy in here, we're going to look at the sharpness of him. We talked about the balance between the focus up front and the focus in the back. And then we have this light spill here. And again, if you remember when we photographed this, we had the lamp and I wasn't really sure if it was working or not, but it does create this light spill and this light spill and this light spill. It might be a source connecting this spilling here and this spilling here. So we want to find this piece where we can add a light right here so that we organically connect the pieces when it comes to light quality. So that will be the next two steps for us to blur and to add light so the pieces fit a little bit better together. So I've been into Capture One and just quickly grabbed a file that had the same perspective but also had the light in it. So we're going to come in here and drag that into Photoshop, and that's it really. We're going to take these elements right here. Maybe I'll just take the whole file. Who knows? Maybe I'll just end up using all this instead of just replacing this. Maybe it's easier for me to take this whole frame and maybe replace the guy. So let me see. I'm going to pull this in here. And what we're going to do is definitely come underneath the color layer, and we're going to turn off this mask. And what we do is to hold down the control key, and this will give us a menu as we hover across the layers. So we're going to disable our layer mask, and then we're going to put this at an opacity like this. Sorry, wrong layer. We're going to put the top one at an opacity, and this will allow me to sort of see underneath here and line this up a little bit. Now we made this quite a bit smaller, so we're going to try to match the size of this as well. Just about there. So what you see now is happening is that I, in the process, like the light and I put it there. And then I moved my camera closer to see more of the interior room. From that closer perspective, I did not shoot another light. So that's a mistake I made when I photographed these backplates and the guy. I would, if I were to do this right, make sure that I had the back plate with the light in it and without the light in it from every camera perspective that I shot. I started with the light and then I asked Mike to take it out, and I ended up shooting the closer perspectives, which are selectors from, without the light. So now we have a little bit of issue here in that we will need to sort of balance this in there without them just falling right on top of each other as they would have if I had this light from this different camera angle. So we just got to rough it in there. It's kind of not great planning, but that's the way it goes sometimes. I have to say, when I take pictures, the mind is pulled in so many different ways, right? You try to remember the initial idea, you try to focus on light, you try to connect with the people, you try to massage all these different things to come into one expression. There's hair and makeup, there's stylists, there's clothing, there's all the people around you that all sort of look to you for what the direction is. And in that process, to remember lights in, lights out, all those small little things at time is quite tough. So we're going to put our opacity up and we're going to try to make do with what we have here anyway, which I think will be fine. Let me see, we're going to enable this layer mask, and then we're going to hit the command key as we hover above the selection of the door. So when we click this, we're going to get our door selection, which will help us when we put this here. Let me see, we're going to go Command Shift I, then we're going to again fill with black, Command Delete, and now this light is sitting at the edge of the door. Now it's right there at the edge, but you see the doors here line up, but maybe I want to see more of it. Let me see. Now you saw me moving it and the selection moved with it. So I'm going to undo that, Command Z, and you're going to unlink these two so I could freely move my picture within the door frame. And that almost feels better. Now it lines up with the original light spill that was sitting outside there. So maybe this is our ticket. Let me see what we could do here. I'm going to relink these. And now it does not quite matter if it lines up with the door behind. Let me see. Now I just made a mistake here. I painted with the black brush onto my selected layer. Obviously not a good idea. What we want to do is to go back in our history, select our mask, and then we can gently pull some of this stuff out and see if we can work with these highlights that we have. Unlink these again, select our light, maybe push it this way. So here we get a little tension point. So this is an aesthetical thing, right? Do we put it there so it bleeds across the edge, or do we put it here and we see the whole light? For me, I think it feels better if it just bleeds off a tiny bit so it doesn't become too much of a tangent there. Right about there. The light illuminates this line coming up the wall that we can't just take away. So I think what's better for us is to maybe paint that in there. Now, you saw me starting to affect this edge that we have, and we want to keep that door frame intact. So come in here, select that, hit Command Hide, and now as we paint on this mask, we will not paint on the door, we will only paint within the selected area. So I'm going to turn that on again and then turn it off so we could see better. And now I think we're starting to fairly well incorporating this light spill. Now there is this door frame here that should come down. So I'm going to paint in here like this. What I just did now was to hit 4 on my keyboard, and the opacity of the brush then becomes 40%. Again, it's a lot of different ways of working. A lot of people like to use the pressure sensitized pen. For me, that feels, it's too random. And I like to know where the numbers are at, and it's kind of been ingrained in me. I kind of know what these numbers feel like. So on my keyboard, I just keep my fingers on 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, 30, 40%. If I quickly hit 3, it will be 33. If I just hit it once, it'll be 30. And you see the percentages change here at the opacity. So I'm going to come down on the opacity a bit and just push this light a little bit out. So we keep our original frame, but still keep the light spill. Now the highlight here and the highlight on the door don't quite line up. So we're going to try to do something here to create light in here and light in there so that we can keep our light source bleeding into the door. So let me see. Technically, we should put this here. Just not, oops, I moved this with the selection, so we got to deselect. I hit it, so I forgot. We could probably put it here and it will line up like this, which would be quite good, but it doesn't feel as well for the photograph to have it standing right there. So we're going to put it back right there, and then we're going to pull in some highlights. Usually don't like to paint highlights, but in this case, we are going to see if we can make that work. I'm going to do this. And we're going to hit Command I. So again, I come into Quick Mask tool. I paint where I want to create the highlight. I exit the Quick Mask tool. I get a selection. I invert that selection. And now if I make my mask, I go to Curves. It will automatically create a mask in that curve layer. I could pull this area up. And you see my highlight on the floor expands to match this a little bit. There. Then we're going to do this the other way. Let me see. We're going to come in here and we're going to select this again. I'm going to go 0 so we get full on our brush. That feels pretty good. Command Shift I. Again, come to Curves, and now we're going to burn a tiny bit. Take down the highlight on the side. Only going to pull on the highlights this time here. I'm going to come into this mask. What you see now when I do this, we get this darker area here, because now we're evenly darkening this. But here I don't want it to be as effective as down in here. So with a soft brush, 20%, I'm going to just come in here and paint onto this layer mask. So if I do this, you see I just painted on a slight opacity there. So it's not as effective in all the areas like that. And that I think will allow me to pull on this even further without it being all funky like that. The last step to this obviously will be to lighten this up here a little bit. So let me see. You're going to go Floor Light Spill 1, and we're going to copy this. I'm going to call this Floor Light Spill 2, just as our modifiers to blend this in. Again, we're going to come and create some light right in here. Exit our Quick Mask. Just going to say yes. My brush was too much at an opacity here at 20%. So the only thing that will happen there is that the curves won't be as effective, which is fine. We can go in there and paint on that afterwards. So we'll pull that up like this. Then we come in with our eraser and we can just work with this here in a tiny bit. What you see here when we start pulling in these shadows is that we get a lot bluer light. The reason for that is that shadows, the color temperature there is a lot bluer than it is in other areas. Shadows are bluer, highlights seems to be cleaner. So you're going to work with that a tiny bit. Overall, I think we're going to go a little bluer anyway, but I think it will help us to address some of that now. So we're going to come in here and we're going to pull the red up. I will sort out some of the cyan cast. I'm going to pull mostly on our shadows here. Let me see. Maybe we only pull on the deepest, darkest areas. Pull that up, and then we're going to come in here in our blue. I'm going to pull this down. I think that's good for now. In the end, maybe the Bedouin will be sitting in front of this, so we'll sort this out as we go along. I think maybe one thing we could do as well is just go into this door stoop here, and we're going to select that, and there, and there, and there. Try one more thing to modify that bleed. RGB, pull this down quite a bit. And now when you see the detail coming in here, I'm going to try to mask out these darker areas. So we select it, select our brush, and there's a larger brush. And at the edges of this larger brush, we obviously will get some bleed that will allow us to not get a hard edge, but take away that, and then it bleeds into this area a bit. I think now we start feeling a lot better. Okay, so that's good for now. We'll fine tune that as we go along for sure. Then it's the sharpness of this guy. We got to address that for sure. And as I talked about, this background is just so distracting, and I wonder if you should actually try to replace that whole background and see what that does. I have some plates where I explored her sitting in the bed here early on of this wallpaper, or maybe even of this wall. And now I'm going to try to see if I could find a piece of this wall or this wallpaper, and we put that back there to take some of that attention away from the wall and to the guy. So number one, let me see here. That's our left panel. So now you can sense that it's starting to be a lot of layers. So what we're going to do here is come in here, and we're going to call this our back plate. So now that I found this layer and I turned it off, I start looking at what's going on right in here and wonder if this could be a nice transition. The floorboards goes the same way, so maybe I'll just use these floorboards here to transition into these floorboards here, and maybe that will help with my highlights a bit. So let's try this. Here's our guy. I'm going to put him in a folder, and this will allow me to do a second mask. This mask then, I'm just going to select it, will be only for the door, and then I can create a mask on the group which will allow me to sort of brush in only in this area and not affect our main mask. That's not bad. Obviously there's a color difference here, and if I do this too much, I don't think it will line up because the floorboards here goes the other way, but let me see, I'm going to go back a little bit, but only in this initial area here. It feels kind of nice. So there's two things here I could choose to do. Either darken this enough so that this lines up, or lighten this enough so that it lines up with this other stuff. So I think maybe we'll start with trying to lighten this area in the blue tones to create our transition a little bit better. I'm going to do this, I'm going to deselect that, and we're going to hit 0 for our brush so that we get full opacity on this right in there. And you see I'm using bigger brushes so that they could bleed into these areas. So I'm going to come into our group, another curve to dodge and burn, and now we're essentially dodging this area, bringing it up. I'm going to add some warmth to it to take away some of that blue. I think just about in there. So now when you see that I created this, it affects both the door and the hallway. Now what we want to do is only affect the background layer, right? This one that sits inside the door. So we come to our group and we put this on normal. Now when you have this on pass through, it will affect this folder and everything beneath it, versus when you put this on normal, it would only affect the layers that's within this folder. So now it's only affecting this layer and not the one that sits below it, the back plate. All right, so now that we did this, these things seems a little extreme here in lightening that up. So maybe we need to come in here and work with this a little bit better. So we're gonna look at the mask that we have on this one right here and see if it's probably from what I just did. Let me see, there we go. See, I need to come back on this and not be as hard. So we come into the eraser tool, add an opacity about maybe 20%, and then we just slightly pull some of this density back in. Just about there for now. All right. Now, you're gonna finally, we've been fussing with this a little bit here, and we don't even know if you're gonna see it by the time we put Tia. That will sit right in here. So I'm gonna work on the blur of this guy a tiny bit. So let's see. For now, there's two ways to do this, truly, to adjust the blur. I could have dragged this layer right in here so it had been a smart layer, which is probably what I should have done, since I didn't do that initially. I did that because I want to keep my Finder all clean so that when we do this recording for you, you don't get to see my Finder, which is behind here with all my different pictures and stuff. So that was my excuse for not using a smart layer, which I don't use that too often anyway, but it would have been good in this case. We're going to copy it instead, and we're going to call this for Guy Blurred. And we can just call this for Guy. And we're going to zoom in. Again, it's going to be the same process almost as what we used for the blurring the background as the introduction picture, where we created the motion blur. This time we're going to select our image. We're going to come into filter, blur. I'm going to do a Gaussian blur this time. And I think that's probably about right, 1.7. Obviously we don't want to take this too far. So let's just start maybe at 1.5. The beauty about doing it this way is that I can just dial this back, obviously, so we get a see-through. But I think this is a good start for us. What's happening when we blur pictures is that we lose some of the grain structure. And here you see we got all this noise in the file, and now we blurred some of that out. So we want to come back into the file and give it some noise. Two ways to do this. We're going to do it overall, which I like to do to pretty much all my composite pieces. And you can start there. We come to the top, we come layer, new layer, and we're going to put this on overlay, which will allow us to click this box, which is really important. Fill with overlay, neutral color 50% gray. And whenever you add this box, you get a neutral gray, which you could add texture to, you could dodge on, you could burn on, without really affecting what's underneath. It's quite clever. So we're going to call this grain. And to this grain layer, we're going to come up here and add noise. And we're going to do that about 4. You see now that this noise in here, it's almost too noisy rather than this that feels more like grain. So we're going to try to accommodate some of that by coming up here again. And we're going to go blur, Gaussian blur. And then we're going to blur this. Obviously not this much. We just want the grain that seemed too noisy to just blur a little bit. So 0.3 pixels maybe. And what you see now is that this background and foreground is starting to blend a little bit better. It's not perfect, but we'll work on that a little bit more as we go along. We might want to add a tiny bit of noise to this layer directly. So let's try that. I'm going to go noise, add noise, and 4 would obviously be too much when you go directly on this layer. So let's just try 1. And I think that feels pretty good. Now we're at 200% here. So if you come out to 100% by the time we print this, by the time we get this all lined up, I think we'll be in good shape. So I don't want to push it further for now. I like this the way it is. I know I could keep on going and really maybe blur him a little bit more, but for now, I think we're in good shape. All right. So as I put this in the background, this foreground seemed to be getting a lot of attention. So I think we want to try to maybe put in 1 or 2 little layers here that will allow us to darken the foreground a tiny bit so that we get some highlights on him, and then again a highlight on Tia. also this stuff that sort of was cool when I had the landscape, just the background by itself, because this, in the case of just a landscape, told me something about what was going on in the space. Now that we have the guy in there, this doesn't quite make sense. So we're going to do a few things. I'm going to take our crop line, which is the white line, which I love quite a bit, and we're going to put it right in here. Let me push that in a little bit as well. We're going to crop our picture to follow that crop line. There, feels a little bit better. I'm going to name some of these layers too so that we can keep track of them. I'm going to come in here and we're going to name this for lamp. We have all these light spills here, and we're going to call, I'm going to pull this back here a tiny bit. Now that I turn them on and off and see what they do, I'm just going to pull down the opacity. So I could easily come in here and move the curve, but often when I do a move and later on I don't quite agree with it, as I layer this picture, it might be easier for me if I want to go back to this to just put this slider up at 100% rather than starting to finick with the file or finick with the curve again. So I'm going to put this at 60% maybe, right in there. Feels pretty good. That feels pretty good. You're going to just copy these and give it the same name all the way up. Copy, call that light spill 3 and light spill 4. I call this whole folder here for guy. And maybe we'll create another one here for these. Let me call this for hallway. So now it's pretty easy when it's organized to come in here and add a curve, and we could push on this a little bit. This will now only affect the back plate, and you could see that as soon as we start doing this, pushing this down, the intention that the guy get is increasing right away. So we can just do this. It's where we were, and this is where we're at. And it's starting to feel a lot better already. I'm going to call this for density. The only reason I choose to call this density is that it's a pull down only, so it becomes a U-shaped curve rather than contrast, which is pretty much always an S-shaped curve. And I'm not sure if you're ready to go into the contrast moves quite yet. I just want to bring a little bit more attention to him. So again, as I do this, not so bad. I talked in the introduction about accidents, exploring, seeing things as they happen, and now the contrast is not so bad. So let me just keep it for now, and I call this contrast. So I have pulled 3 pictures into the file, and this is kind of where I will part ways with you a little bit. You have had this file, so hopefully you've managed to come along with me in this process, and I'm going to give you one more file, and I'm going to place that in there real quick, which will be your composite piece really to this. So here I have a frame of the bed, and again, you're going to talk about your assignment, but in short, that will be to try to match artificial lighting and the setup that I have and put someone into this bed. So I'm just going to select it real quick for you before we continue with placing my foreground element in there. I'm just going to come along the bed here real quick. And again, same process, lasso tool, selecting around in this mask box. We'll just hit Option Delete for the black. And there's our file. So what I hope to do with this process, right, is really for you to participate. Again, it's learning by doing. I don't want you guys to be retouchers. I want you guys to be photographers, to think, to create, to be unique, and be really passionate about creating stuff that reflects who you are. That was my mantra in the first tutorial, and it really is on this one too. We looked at how we could make this different, and the difference, I hope, is this, that you will find a bed. Doesn't have to be this one because it's already in this photograph. Just find a sheet and light someone in a similar manner to this. And this picture is actually quite forgiving when it comes to light because there's so many different light sources. Just in this photograph only, there's 1, 2, and 3. And if you place a highlight right in here in the center of the bed, you will match my highlight. I had a strobe sitting right outside the frame right here, coming right down here. And if you look at the footage, you can see behind me and you can see where the strobes were. Put a girl or a guy or yourself or someone on this bed and place them beautifully in there. It should be quite simple. There's going to be some trouble maybe masking around the bed, but otherwise the picture is there. I'm just going to mask this in there a little bit. We're going to come in here and use our magic wand tool. There's quick select, which you could just follow around the path, or the magic wand, which for me is a little old school, having used Photoshop since there only was the magic wand and there was no quick selection tool. I'm just going to use this and select real quick along the sheets for you so you can get a sense of what I would do. I would come in here in the selection, and as you hold down the control key in the selection and click, you will get a short little menu, and here's feather, and we will do this one since it's sharper, just 0.5. So you don't have to come up to the selects and modify and feather here. You can just hold down the control key, get the menu, and feather it from there. So we're going to come in here. So what I did essentially was to click along this edge, and it selected most of this pretty well. Then we're going to help this selection by taking away the things that we don't want and add the things we do want. So I'm going to come in here, and when I have a selection already and use any other selection tool and I hold down the shift key, it will add to that selection. So you see I selected these areas, but these are not selected. I just come in with my lasso tool, hold down shift, and just can come in here and slowly just track this and paint in, and it will select it. The other way around is to hold down option. You see I get a little minus sign, plus, minus, and with the minus sign, just come in here and do this. The walls are the same, even though they don't quite line up in the corner, but they should be quite easy to blend when you get into using curves to blend pieces. And we're going to look at that in a minute. So again, we're going to zoom out. Maybe I'm going to deselect this stuff here and take away that, oops, Command C for undoing that, and then exclude that little corner of the bed. And maybe do like that. And then maybe we push this in a little bit like this. And then we're really quite close. Really quite close. So I would just say from here, okay, let me modify it a little bit more. I thought I would let you go and explore this on your own, but let me get you a little bit closer. This is obviously too bright for me for this space. We're gonna come down in here as we just did, get a curve, and then we're gonna select in between here. So you just hold down the option key and put the arrow right in between, and that will connect, oops, there. That will connect the curve to only this layer, and it will allow us to come in here and modify just this layer. So I'm going to pull down my top anchor point, and I'm going to pull this down here. And then just where the light is spilling, I want to undo this darkness. This darkness I think feels good on the bottom right in here, but not quite right here where the light is. So I'm going to come in and undo the spill right in here. Just following the light as it would be if it fell on this bed perfectly. And we can disable our layer mask, and you can see kind of what it was. Now that this bed, we essentially put the bed closer to the lamp than it was. So maybe we should try to make it smaller so that it feels even better. It's a good reference to have when we're actually right there on this location. So maybe we'll just pull the bed down in here maybe. Now, felt better. I'm making it look bigger. So there, from there on out, I would really leave it to you to lay someone on a piece of sheet, put someone there and try to lie them to fit there perfectly. You will see from here on out how I will do this with Tia. Now, she was in that space, but again, I lit her kind of separately. And I lit her, I had this big strobe in here, which was my key light, and I had another one hitting her right here. So I I truly lit her separate from the background anyway, so you could do the same approach. You will see me go through and retouch Thea till she fits in there just beautifully, and then you could follow along on your piece and I work on my piece. So hope that makes sense. I could have just given you my talent select as well. But again, then you would just be repeating what I did or following along, and you will learn how to retouch. I truly would encourage you to shoot this piece yourself, and then you would see how my approach is truly firsthand. If you manage to apply one of your pieces into one of my background pieces, you have really just created something that morphs really my process with your personality. So that's my goal in this. So please, you could follow along for this, but if you want to use this background plate and shoot a person, please then just compare your process and my process in the retouch, and we will hopefully end up in a place where I choose one woman and one feeling and you choose another woman and another feeling, or another guy, whoever that is. So tell your story, think about what this foreground piece is for you. Maybe you take the bed away. Maybe it's just someone standing right here, because I find this landscape to be quite lonely, especially with this picture frame. So maybe you shoot someone standing. Maybe it's a different story for you. Actually, as I talk about it, that would be kind of cool for me too, to have someone standing there. So I'm going beyond the retouch now, and I really should have left this for the assignment part that comes after. But since this is the crossroad, I just wanted to bring this in there and share this with you. So we're going to take this bed, and I thought I would delete it, but maybe I'll keep it. There is going to be some pieces in case I choose to flop Thea around, which I ended up doing for the editorial piece. If I end up doing that, I might keep that bed in there. So here we are, and this is the select we have for Tia. So I'm going to just massage her in there so that she feels kind of good. Again, perspectives are now really quite off. Since I straightened my background, I probably should straighten her as well. But I don't really want to mess with this elongated body too much, right? We could just, if I just do this real quick to show you, I hit Command T, we'll get my box, and then come into the box and just use Control, and I get the pull down menu, and then I could choose what I want to do. So I'm just going to do distort here real quick. Just show you what happens if I try to line this up. Obviously, this does not look too good. So now the wall is kind of straight, but this line is not straight and she's all distorted. So rather than trying to match perspectives here, we're just going to cut her out. So I'm going to call her Tia before we move on. And just quickly run through it like this. Obviously, we're going to fine tune this later on, but I just want to find a placement that feels good. So this is the issue that I ran into. This is really how she fits into the space. And obviously that completely crashes with the guy. When I photographed it and I put the quick comp together, I saw this and I thought, oh, I'll just move the door. In our case, I think I'm just going to move her. So one option is this, placing her right in here. And then obviously we're going to mask out the bed and make the colors fit. It's a simpler composition in that it follows the eye here and comes right up to the guy. But what I ended up exploring and spent a lot of time with was to create the dynamic slightly different. So you expand the distance between the two. And I think for the story that I want to tell, it feels a lot better. I probably should have seen this when I was there and explored the bed the other way, which I did, but then it didn't quite feel right either. And that's the way with composites, to be honest. A trap that I fall into and did obviously for this picture is that one judges the picture one see in front of it for what it is. So I created a beautiful picture I felt of Tia in the bed as it was, not being obviously completely aware of what my composite would look like. So I mentioned this when we were on location as well in Bishop, where I mentioned here's the landscape, and when you photograph the landscape, make sure you don't compose for the landscape, but you imagine that the train tracks will be there and the train cart will be up front. It's two different things. I remind myself of this every time I do a composite and try to see it in front of me. Where is this composite piece? And obviously in this case, the head and the doorway kind of crashed a bit. So the options obviously would be to put Tia this way and open that space up like this so that we could tell her story this way, or turn her around and tell the story this way. And I think either way is nice enough. It's really just how we want to do the piece. So I'm going to try to explore it this way for now. I think, let me see, I'm going to turn that off. The way this picture is now as a landscape, I quite like, in that you have the bed and it travels sort of in this way. So maybe I'm predispositioned, to work this way, but for now, this is what we got to try to do. Now, what happens here, maybe this is the piece I should use right underneath here. So I think that's what I'm going to do, because that will help us work together a little bit better. This is not the piece that I used earlier when I finished this for the editorial magazine, but it's going to be fun for us to work with these two together. So I'm going to re-import this picture, and we're going to lay Tia on this bed. And as I put her on there, you could put your girl or guy on there as well, and we'll follow this process along together. So again, we're going to take a quick little break, and I'm going to import the pieces, and we'll be back at it.